You certainly don't have to be a churchgoer, much less a Christian, to be familiar with the term Good Samaritan. You could ask just about anybody what a Good Samaritan is, and you would probably get a description of someone who puts aside concerns for their own safety and well-being to help another person in need. Or you might get examples of Good Samaritans, everything from the woman who makes sure the elderly airline passenger makes his connecting flight, even though she misses hers, to the person who stops to help a stranded motorist on a dark road late at night, to the story in the paper many years ago now of the man in New York who jumped onto the third rail and saved a person who had fallen onto the subway tracks by lying on top of him while the train roared over them. If you Google the words Good Samaritan, you get just over 8 million results. There is never any shortage of Good Samaritan stories, many of them both heartbreaking and heartwarming. What you might not get by asking the question is any knowledge of where the story of the Good Samaritan comes from. I'll never forget watching a segment of the Jay Leno show when he asked the Good Samaritan question in one of his People on the Street interviews. Almost everybody could give the definition of a Good Samaritan, but only a handful were able to identify it as a Bible story. Maybe most people are also familiar with the term because there are hundreds, probably thousands, of hospitals and nursing homes named Good Samaritan, both here and abroad. There is an international relief organization called Samaritan's Purse, and perhaps familiar to some of you, the Green Valley Samaritans in Arizona, who walk the desert providing food and water for undocumented immigrants making their way to the border. We have a Good Samaritan law in this country, which reads in part, "A person at the scene of an emergency who knows that another person is exposed to or has suffered grave physical harm shall, to the extent that the person can do so without danger or peril to self or others, give reasonable assistance to the exposed person." Moreover, individual states have Good Samaritan statutes on the books. The bottom line is that we get it. We understand the term Good Samaritan to mean someone who gives assistance, personally, institutionally, usually without counting the cost. So if we're all clear about being a Good Samaritan, is there anything left to say about the parable of the Good Samaritan as it is told in the Gospel of Luke? Well, it is often said that familiarity breeds contempt. In this case, not the kind of contempt that breeds cynicism or ridicule, but the kind of contempt that believes we already know what this story means without having to think about it very much. In other words, we've been there, done that, and got the t-shirt. One writer notes that we come by this point of view honestly, since from the very beginning, the church, in its infinite wisdom, has called the story the parable of the Good Samaritan. So we're already programmed to know how it ends, or to know how we're supposed to believe. That same writer goes on to say, "I know for sure that Jesus did not give titles to his parables. So I'm pretty safe in revealing to you that Jesus didn't call this story the parable of the Good Samaritan." A couple of things about parables. First of all, parables invite interpretation. Theologian Fred Craddock puts it this way: the hearer has a feeling of strangeness in a very familiar narrative, and some interpretation is not only invited, but urged. He goes on to say they are interesting, and as is true of most stories, they disarm and engage, but still they must be interpreted. In this sense, they are like poetry, lying between the opaque and the obvious, evoking meanings and feelings. Secondly, parables are all about justice and mercy. Writer and storyteller Megan McKenna tells us that parables draw us in softly and with subtlety, and then hit us with the hammer of revolution. She says parables are revolutionary, subverting reality and undermining the existing structures and systems and relationships and attitudes, all the trappings of the status quo that keep the least among us in slavery and without hope, while we look the other way, choosing to be oblivious to their claim upon us. Finally, parables usually contain something that would have shocked or offended the original hearers. For example, in this particular parable, it would have been within the realm of acceptability if Jesus had made the anonymous man in the ditch a Samaritan. Then he would have become the object of any decent Jew's concern. But to make the Samaritan the hero, as it were, would probably have appalled and angered those who were listening. Of course, we know that the relationship between the Samaritans and the Jews was anything but cordial. You might remember a little about that when we had the story of the healing of the lepers last fall, but it never hurts to recall a little of that history in order to understand the mutual hatred and distrust between Israel and Samaria. After the glory days of the great kings, Saul and David and Solomon, the kingdom split into two parts: the northern kingdom, Israel, with its capital in Samaria, and the southern kingdom, Judah, whose capital was in Jerusalem. In the early 8th century, the northern kingdom was attacked by the Assyrians and taken as a colony. And over time, the Jews and the Assyrians intermarried, and the offspring of these mixed marriages were called Samaritans. Nearly a century later, the southern kingdom fell to the armies of Babylon, and the temple at Jerusalem was destroyed, and many of the Jews were taken into exile as servants of the Babylonians. In captivity, they held on to their faith and their traditions in spite of great persecution, unlike the people of the northern kingdom. So when they were freed after 85 years of captivity and allowed to return to their homeland, their neighbors to the north, the Samaritans, became a symbol of compromised faith. They were universally despised as traitors to the authentic faith and held in great contempt. They were considered religious and racial outcasts, a type of those tragic people throughout history who cannot clearly identify with one culture or another. And goodness knows most of us have been around long enough to have witnessed the kind of prejudice and bigotry and cruelty that often results. The primary source of contention, you remember, was the location of the true place of worship. The Samaritans built a shrine on Mount Gerizim and claimed it was there that God dwelled, not at the temple in Jerusalem. And even though it was later demolished by Jewish troops, the rivalry continued. Suffice it to say that those listening to Jesus that day were probably quite uncomfortable with what Jesus implied in telling the parable. Now, while we're thinking about the power of parables and speaking of discomfort, I want to read you this modern-day parable within a parable written by the Reverend Edward Marquardt, an outspoken Lutheran pastor, imagine that, who is well known for both his preaching and his storytelling skills. He prefaces the story by saying, "It happened on the Jericho Road. It always happens on the Jericho Road." The Jericho Road is a 17-mile road that connects Jerusalem to Jericho. That road drops 3,600 feet in those 17 miles. It is a steep, winding, descending, remote road that for centuries has been a place for robberies. Now, before I tell you this story, you need to know that Ed Marquardt is an equal opportunity offender. If your theological or political sensibilities are offended by what he says, just wait a few seconds. You can be sure that someone else's buttons will be pushed in the next sentence. So he tells this parable. One day a priest went to visit the Jericho Road. He was a very religious man, and he saw somebody who had been hurt on the Jericho Road, and he was mortified. He came and gave that person the last rites, and he quickly ran back to his parish as fast as he could. The following Sunday, he gave a sterling sermon about the Jericho Road, and he felt so much better. Then there was a pastor who went down to the Jericho Road, and he was appalled by what he saw. It was awful on the Jericho Road, and so he came back to his church, and do you know what he did? He taught a course called The Biblical Understanding and Perspective of Poverty. They showed films of people who were being beaten up on the Jericho Road, and everybody felt rotten, but they all felt so good that they had finally done something for the people on the Jericho Road. There was still another person. He was a revivalist. Now, he didn't go to the Jericho Road, but he saw it on television. He then gathered 65,000 people together in the Jerusalem Dome, and they sang songs about the Jericho Road. You should have seen them with their microphones and all their spotlights, how they sang and prayed so beautifully about the Jericho Road. Then there was this left-wing activist who went to the Jericho Road, and he was incensed by what he saw. He was an angry man, and he came back, and he organized demonstrations in the cities. He got all of the young people out of school. They shut down universities, and they marched on the Jerusalem monument at the capital city. Yes, they were very active for the people on the Jericho Road. But then there was a person on the political right, and he went down to the Jericho Road and saw that he had moral decay in this country, and he thought, we've got to solve this problem. We've got to raise employment and change the economy so there won't be so much violence on the Jericho Road. So what did he do? He lessened taxes for the rich, so the rich would have more money to make investments, so there would be more jobs for the poor. And he increased the sales tax on the poor, so that all the people could help pay for the costs of maintaining the Jericho Road. And while the priest and the pastor and the revivalist and the left-wing activist and the right-wing moralist were all busy, the man on the Jericho Road died. Here's the other thing about parables. Not only do they invite interpretation, they invite us into the story as participants. Interestingly, when we hear stories, our tendency is almost always to identify with the character that we know the least about, so that we can pour out all of our attributes on that character. It's safe to say that nobody hearing the story that day that Jesus told it would have identified with the Samaritan. That would have been unthinkable. After all, the lawyer can't even bring himself to say the word Samaritan when he's asked which of the three travelers proved to be the neighbor to the person in the ditch. But neither would they have been comfortable imagining themselves as the priest or the Levite, although that would have been more palatable if either of them had responded even a little differently. In this parable, then, the person who had been known the least would have been the anonymous person lying half dead in the ditch, and that turned everything upside down. It still turns everything upside down. We still have a hard time being the person in the ditch, being the person in need, or the one who's wounded. We'd much rather like to imagine ourselves as the Good Samaritan, kind and compassionate and caring and merciful, and many times, by the grace of God, we are that kind of person. Now, if this were only a story about being encouraged to be a decent person, to be kind and caring whenever we had the opportunity, it would be uplifting, but it wouldn't be very interesting. Now, the reason this parable is so compelling is that the person who responds, the Samaritan, does so because he knows what it means to be wounded, what it means to be left to die in a ditch. He knows how it feels to be despised and ignored and shamed and deeply hurt. We can all remember times when we have been in the ditch, when we've lain there for what seems like an eternity without any hope of help. And we can all remember that person or that group of friends who stopped long enough to pull us out, tend our wounds, and stay with us until we were well. And all of us can remember times when we have said, "Who is my neighbor? How can I love my neighbor as myself? What about fostering dependency in the neighbor or wearing myself out just putting Band-Aids on wounds that need so much more?" Compassion for another proceeds not from our strong side or our decent side. It proceeds from that part of us that has been wounded, that part which we might even feel ashamed of. Charity, as we usually understand it, means that the response of the relatively strong for the relatively weak and needy is there. Often charity in this sense makes the giver feel good, but the recipient feel terrible and resentful. And then we wonder how it is that they can be possessed of such ingratitude. But there is no room in Jesus' teaching for charity of this kind. Compassion always proceeds from that part of us that has been wounded, that feels alienated, even despised. That's the part of us that is able to reach out to another's hurt and pain without being superior or judgmental. We do our best, even when it seems that nobody or nothing is likely to make a difference. Perhaps like writer Mary Shore, we say, surely someone could call a meeting of the county commissioners and get some light on that stretch of highway between Jerusalem and Jericho. Until the work is done, we could organize escorts. The bandits could be trained for honest work. Of course, all of this means that some of us run the risk of compassion fatigue, and we will have to read and write more books on self-care. And then she writes, but look, for mercy's sake, look in the ditch. There is someone hurt. Do something. Do what the home raising from Moses taught you, namely, show the kind of mercy that means rolling up your sleeves and getting your hands dirty. Do this, and the guy in the ditch will have a chance at life. Do this, and you will live too. Amen.